aging, yes, because all that is connected and very connected to the, I would say, pretty much a main theme at Champagne Palmer when it comes to talking about the wines and not only, as I mentioned earlier, time. Time is a very strong element at Champagne Palmer, a main ingredient in everything we do. So regarding the Brut Reserve, indeed, which is the signature of Champagne Palmer, the timeless signature of the house, I would say, even though time is so important in how the blend is brought together and conceived. So that autolytic character that you pick up is definitely connected to the aging on the lees contact. Autolysis is, as you probably know, it's basically the dead yeast that are being, the yeast cells that are being broken down by the enzymes and that give back to the wine many different characteristics, proteins and amino acids that are going to change the character of the wine, make it evolve and develop, I would say, those secondary aromas, those very charming, typical champagne character, I would say, that distinguishes champagne very much from other sparkling wines. I'd say that autolytic character, which you can find on quite young champagnes already. I mean, the autolytic character is something that is going to develop in the wines as of 2 years, probably on the lees, but it's going to become more and more pronounced with time, which is why there are rules in champagne for aging. A non-vintage in champagne has to be aged a minimum of 15 months on the lees. So I guess that that autolytic, what makes the difference between champagne and other sparkling wines, that autolytic character starts to appear in the wine even as of the minimum required aging. But it is going to become more and more important in the wine as time goes by. And we definitely give our wine that time to develop that autolytic character that you picked up, Lucy. It is part of the Palmer signature style that people speak about brioche. We like to speak about pastry character. It's like a biscuity pastry character that develops. And it is something that we like at Palmer. It is part of our style. It gives a richness, texture, elegance, depth. So it is definitely something that is part of the recipe on all the wines of the Palmer range that we are going to talk about, as you will see. So lees aging, definitely. For the Palmer Brut Reserve, we go way beyond the minimum required lees contact, lees aging. I mentioned 15 months would be the minimum in champagne. The average might be around 2.5 years, I guess. If that, but at Palmer, we're, I would say, double the average, way beyond the average, at least 4 years on lees, but on regularly based on the rotation of our cuvées, we see that the average lees aging we have on the different releases in real time in the markets, we are always around 4.5 years on the lees for the half magnum, as we say at Palmer. We like to say the half magnum.
Half magnum. I like it. Yeah, 4 years is definitely a lot. I mean, it's not uncommon to see 3 years, but as soon as you go to 4 years, you know it's going to be next level up.
Yes.
So would you say that this is perhaps disgorged in 2019 and maybe base year of 14 or 15?
It is base year 14. It is base year 14, and it was disgorged. The exact disgorgement, I mean, I don't know what bottle you have, and there's no disgorgement date there for you. Very soon we will be offering access to this more precise information to our Palmer fans and champagne fans around the world who like to have access to disgorgement information. But usually we keep our wines after disgorgement at least 6 months. We try to keep the wine 6 months to a year after disgorgement. Our cellar master Xavier Berdin says always that the sweet spot would be probably around 8-10 months for most of our wines. The exception would be the rosé, which we will taste later. But 8 to 10 months is good for Champagne Palmer, at least 6. And that is a lot. And many producers in Champagne do not go that far. And so we believe that that time after disgorgement is also very important. So you're looking at, if you're saying 4.5 years on lees and at least 6 months after disgorgement, you're looking at least 5 years between the bottling and the release, and 6 years between the actual harvest and the time of consumption in the market. So indeed, we are in 2020, and look, we are enjoying a Brut Reserve base 2014. That time after disgorgement, maybe we can talk about that after, but I haven't answered part of your question regarding, and probably key, and the key part for the Brut Reserve of Champagne Palmer is, as the name indicates, suggests, the reserve wines, the importance of reserve wines in the blend, in the Palmer recipe. Reserve wines are essential in Champagne. It is part of the Champagne recipe generally. Reserve wines are important to, first of all, maintain consistency in style and in expression. They are quite helpful to, I would say, compensate a potential lack of structure, acidity that we could have in some vintages. First example comes to my mind is 2003, which was a very warm year in Champagne. We've had a series of warm years recently, but 2003 was memorable for all of us in Champagne, and not only in Champagne.
Very contentious vintage. I think there are very varied opinions on the 2003 vintage, but it is changing. I think that initially everyone thought it was too hot, but people are changing their minds. So sorry, go on. But
that's right.
Fascinating.
We can talk about that a little later, Lucy. I have an interesting point to highlight on this as far as Palmer is concerned. But yes, in 2003, Champenoise had to generally use a lot more reserve wines than what they usually would. I remember back then I was, when I was working on the other side of the Montagne de Reims with Champagne Ayala, the non-vintage Brut had over 50% reserve wines on the 2003 base, because we had to compensate that lack of freshness, I would say, and structure back then. It was the same for all of us in Champagne. So the reserve wines are very, very important, are a wonderful tool actually for the Champenois. It's quite a clever approach to winemaking, a clever model. And in Champagne, we have this, I would say, a gift, general gift, historical gift that we inherited to adapt our processes to, I would say, what is best and what makes most sense to deliver the best possible wine experience to consumers, to Champagne lovers all around the world. And the reserve wines are a great, great tool for that. So the reserve wines at Champagne Palmer are important. So important in terms of, first of all, keeping the style consistent. That is a first way, for reason for which we use reserve wines, like everyone. And the way we approach reserve wines, I would say, takes that specific approach to the next level. Very often in Champagne, reserve wines are going to be base wines, les vins clairs, still wines that are kept in tanks, wines that are, I would say, considered worthy of being a great ingredient for future non-vintage blends. Wines that are going to bring that lacking element, whatever that will be, depending on the base vintage. So many cellar masters are identifying those wines at the vintage and isolating them, keeping them in store for the future blends. At Champagne Palmer, our approach is I would say, very pragmatic when it comes to reserve wines. We believe that in order to ensure that the style of our non-vintage brut is going to remain consistent, the best way is to use reserve wines that are actually the blend of our brut non-vintage itself. So the recipe of Palmer Brut Reserve that you are enjoying is a blend of mainly Chardonnay, as we highlighted. We are very fortunate to have as much Chardonnay as we have. It's 50% of the Palmer vineyard. And the Brut Reserve, I would say, is a picture of the Palmer vineyard, essentially. And we have always at least 50% Chardonnay in the non-vintage Brut, with that highlight of Chardonnay from the Montagne de Reims, which again is going to make, therefore, our Brut non-vintage stand out from the crowd in terms of style and aromatic expression. First, it's going to stand out because it's quite rare, and I don't know of many producers that will have as much Chardonnay on the non-vintage Brut as we have. More than 50% is very, very rare. And it's a specific Chardonnay on top of that. It's not the, I would say, the usual Chardonnay from the Côte des Blancs, even though, of course, we would love to have fruit in the Côte des Blancs. Our Chardonnay happens to be in the Montagne de Reims, and we feel blessed because it has put Palmer on the map. It has really made a strong point of difference. So the reserve wines are the blend of Brut Reserve, that 50% Chardonnay, 40% Pinot Noir, roughly, and 10% Pinot Meunier. That's the picture of the Palmer vineyard, essentially, and the typical blend of Palmer Brut Reserve, which the percentages can change slightly depending on the blend, but essentially it is that. And so, including reserve wines, which on average at Champagne Palmer are going to represent 30 to 35% of the final blend of our Brut Reserve non-vintage, which is a very high percentage.
That is a lot.
That is a lot. Some houses have higher percentages than that. There are a couple that are known for having very high percentages of reserve wines. One I'm very familiar with that I was working with in the first part of my career in Champagne is Bollinger, who are known for having more than 50% reserve wines in the Spécial Cuvée. But at Palmer, this 35% is already very important in the blend. And at the end of the day, it is not a competition. It's what we believe is necessary on an average to maintain the style consistent. And so it is blends of Palmer Brut Reserve, once again, Lucie, that are kept in tanks. The finished blend, we're going to bottle most of the finished blend, that final 50, 40, 10 Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, 35% reserve wines. Once that blend has come together, we bottle it in the spring after the harvest, late into the spring. We start our bottling much later than the average again, and that is another indication of how we take time at Palmer to do things well. Many are going to start bottling in the new year, and at Palmer we start our bottling. We already know that the next vintage, the next non-vintage Brut is going to be bottled. The beginning of the bottling is going to start, I believe, from what I had, the discussions I had recently with our cellar master. If I remember correctly, it's going to be around the 25th of April, something like that is when we're going to start bottling the non-vintage Brut 2020 base. So that the time is important also to fine tune the recipe until the last moment, as far as we can go. And so those reserve wines, which are finished blends of Brut Reserve, once we have bottled most of the production, we are going to keep a large tank of Brut Reserve from each year. The finished blend is going to be kept as a still wine to be fed into the future blends of Brut Reserve. So in each blend of Brut Reserve, the 30-35% reserve wines are blends of Brut Reserve from the past, who themselves also included 30-35% reserve wines, which were also blends from the past, etc., etc. So it's like a perpetual reserve of Brut Reserve that is fed into Brut Reserve. Not really like a perpetual reserve. It's not like a Solera concept, because we have separated each single non-vintage based Brut Reserve blend, kept in tank in our winery that is fully dedicated to reserve wines.